शहरी में तो भाई चूदो हुआ उतना सा लेपन का पहला शाही हो आता अलिया का कापले हां कापले टीचर गुड मॉर्निंग बायकास्टे ताचड़ कंपराड़ी ताचड़ बड़ा दे चले कमर अपने बड़ा किया साईं जन तालित रखन था जो नंदड़े शहर में हां शहर इलाके में साईं जन के पाए तो के रात तो जन्म वरतो जो पाए हां टाइम हुआ साईं जन रात जे पाए जन्म वरतो एकड़े नंदड़े जे पाए साईं जन्म जनवरी जे महीने में वतो हुयो आ हां साईं न मार्च साईं जन मार्च महीने जे रात मत मजाक के पूछा करियो हां साईं तां याद आ कि तां डेट ऑफ बर्थ छा है जी न नहीं नजदीक हूंदो असां हां ॿुधायो मार्च मां न हां ॿुधायो छा 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 अच्छा मार्च केड़ो मार्च डेट ऑफ बर्थ बुधा पर के कहने हां साहब हेलो हां सर ये को नगला की खराब थी हां ये लोग गले नहीं आ जाएंगे वो लीड लगे ये रात तो क्यों दिया रे बंसुर ये वो लीड लगे तो 4 जगह रही थी तो 8 भी लगे अल्लाह आज ही देख करने में करो मार मलाई नदी के बाद में छुट्टी मिला
Hello? Hello?
Bashir, hello?
കേൾക്കാമോ?
കേക്കാം.
Mr. Just let me confirm. Shraddha, are you? Shraddha?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Gobika?
Are you able to hear me?
Gobika?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. And Shraddha? Hello?
Yes, good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Okay. Raji teacher, let us start.
Okay, start.
Okay, yeah.
A very good morning to one and all. Before we begin, I remind all those who have joined to mute both your video and audio. A very good morning to one and all. It gives me immense pleasure to extend to you a very warm welcome on behalf of the Department of Economics, NMSM Government, College Calcutta, who has clubbed all of us for the webinar series on contemporary macroeconomic issues. To speak about Ecothought, Ecothought is an initiative by the PG Department of Economics. It is a platform to promote research and discussion on everyday economics. Ecothoughts have organized a number of seminars within the campus where faculties and students had presented their research papers on various topics. This webinar is also one such humble effort. And I'm very happy to say that today we have some of the very eminent personalities here with us, and we are really fortunate to have you all. Hope this seminar will help you to add more to your knowledge, and get updated in the topics discussed here today. Surely, this webinar is going to be a different experience to you all. Now, I call on Mr. K.K. Bashir, Coordinator of Ecothought and Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, NMSM Government College, to propose the welcome address. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Hello. Very good morning and warm welcome to all participants joining today's webinar. We have participants joining across India and abroad as well. It gives me immense pleasure to extend warm welcome on behalf of Postgraduate Department of Economics, NMSM Government College, Calcutta, conducting one-day webinar on the topic Contemporary Macroeconomic Issues. This webinar is organized under the platform of Ecothought. So before doing my task on this webinar, I would like to say a few things about Ecothought. It is a platform where students and teachers join occasionally to present and discuss latest development in the field of economics. Last time, before the outbreak of COVID pandemic, Ecothought have conducted discussion about 2020 Nobel laureates and their important contributions to economics. After COVID pandemic, we have conducted first of its online webinar series under Ecothought under the same theme. I'm very happy that today we are going to conduct second of its online seminar with the same theme. The topic that we are going to carry forward today is, as I said earlier, contemporary macroeconomic issue. I think this topic reveals considerable significance in the sense that National Account Statistics in its recent data tells us that Indian economy at present experiencing one of the lowest economic growth ever since independence. The issue of unemployment and inequality in India is high and uncomparable among all developing nations of the world. Poverty, deprivation and impoverishment, etc., experiencing in every nooks and corners of the country. Moreover, the outbreak of COVID pandemic has brought the country and world at large at least one decade backward economically. NMSM Government College, PG Department of Economics, under Ecothought, is conducting one-day webinar in this critical background. I think this kinds of academic intervention is helpful for faculties, students and scholars who thought about ongoing macroeconomic challenges of the country now facing. With this, my task on this webinar is to welcome you all participants who are assembled at different virtual spaces of the world. First, we have with us our college IQSE coordinator, Dr. Shibu B, Assistant Professor of English, to give presidential address for our program today. Though Shibu sir belongs to language department of the college, it has been noticed in different programs that his keen interest, enthusiasm and curiosity in different aspects, perspectives and topics in different schools of thoughts and economics. It gives us immense pleasure that Dr. Shibu sir is with us and going to give us his presidential address for our program today. On behalf of Economics Department and Ecothought, I cordially welcome Dr. Shibu sir for this program. Next, we have with us our principal, Dr. Rajamol MS, to inaugurate our program today. Dr. Rajamol has been the master brain and true figure behind the success of all seminars and the activities of the department. We, the Department of Economics, is lucky enough to have Rajamol teacher with all supports and encouragement for all kinds of activities it conducts. On behalf of Ecothought and Economics Department, I humbly welcome Dr. Rajamol teacher to this program. Next, as part of today's webinar, we have a keynote address by Dr. Shraddha Verma, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Kancharapara College, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. Dr. Shraddha has completed his master and doctoral degree from University of Hyderabad. His area of research is economic growth, inequality, Political Economy, Economic Development and Migration. Economic Development and Migration. Dr. Shraddha has publication in both national and international journals. His area of specification include macroeconomics, economics of growth and development, and political economy. When I asked Shraddha for a keynote address for today's program, he has immediately nodded for the same. I take this opportunity to thank you, Shraddha, for accepting our humble invitation. And we all are very eager and curious to know your presentation today. In keynote address, Dr. Shraddha will be presenting for the topic, Economic Growth in India, a Critical Perspective. On behalf of Economics Department and Ecothought, I cordially welcome Dr. Shraddha for this program. Next, we have with us Gopika Gigi, Assistant Professor Economics, University College Trivandrum, for the first paper presentation. Ms. Gopika has completed her Master and MPhil from University of Hyderabad. Her area of specialization include participatory development and development studies. Her area of present research is in Kerala decentralization and development. For today's webinar, Ms. Gopika will be presenting for the topic Post-Reform Kerala, Regime of Accumulation and its Developmental Impact. On behalf of PG Department of Economics and Ecothought, I cordially welcome Ms. Gopika Gigi for this webinar. Next, we have with us Ms. N. Shraddha Verma, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Maitrey College from Delhi University. Her area of specialization is in public economics, development economics, and education economics. She teaches mathematical methods for economics, statistics, and Indian economy. Her area of present research is in broad financial economics. She will be presenting for topic monetary policy and insurance sector and analysis from Indian context. On behalf of Economics Department and Ecothought, I sincerely welcome Ms. Shraddha Verma for this webinar. Next, at the end of all paper presentation, we have today a question and answer session that will be moderated by Dr. Munir Babu, Assistant Professor Economics, NMSM Government College, Calcutta. On behalf of Economics Department and Ecothought, I cordially welcome Dr. Munir Babu for this webinar. Next, we have our HOD, Mr. Biju Abraham, Assistant Professor Economics, NMSM Government College, Calcutta, to deliver vote of thanks. I take this opportunity to sincerely thank Mr. Biju Abraham for his help, for helping me all along from beginning to end and making this even more successful. On behalf of Ecothought and Economics Department, I cordially welcome Mr. Biju Abraham for this webinar. In addition to the participant from India, we have received registration for the participation from foreign countries as well. Total, we have more than 250 participation, which include faculties, researchers, research scholars, MPhil and PhD scholars, UG and PG students and others. All have assembled at different virtual spaces like Google Meet, YouTube, etc. On behalf of Economics Department and Ecothought, I welcome all the participants for this webinar. I also welcome all the colleagues, Sina Miss, Nancy Miss, and other teaching staffs of this college and students, and anyone who are listening to this event, to this seminar. I'm sure that this webinar will be helpful, useful, and thought-provoking to the all participants and policy makers at large. Once again, I welcome all the participants for this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I request Dr. Shibu B, IQAC Coordinator and Assistant Professor, Department of English, NMSM Government College, to deliver the presidential address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Bashir.
Thank you, Akila. Good morning to all. Respected principal of this college, Dr. Rajimul MS, who is inaugurating this webinar, Dr. Shraddha Verma, who is delivering the keynote address, other speakers of the day, Ms. Gobiga Gigi, Mrs. N. Shraddha Verma, Mr. Biju Abraham, Head of the Department, Economics, Dr. Munir Babuyam, other teachers, scholars from different parts of the world. First of all, I would like to appreciate, congratulate the Department of Economics on organizing a webinar on the contemporary macroeconomics issues. In fact, it is with great admiration that we look into the academic activities chalked out by the Department of Economics of this college. They have already hosted 3 webinars, including an international webinar. As it has been already pointed out in the welcome speech, the setting up of a platform, that is Ecothought, for intellectual deliberations and serious discourses on contemporary issues is in fact a laudable initiative. The topic under discussion today is indeed very much relevant in a context where the global economy is brought to a standstill consequent to the outbreak of the pandemic. The present crisis raises some serious questions on the vulnerability of economic globalization. This webinar will throw some light upon or it yield a nuanced understanding of the current economic scenario, especially on the impact of the economic liberalization experience. Paucity of time does not permit me to further my presidential address. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Now I request Dr. Rajimul MS, Principal, NMSM Government College, to inaugurate this webinar series. Over to you, ma'am.
Respected Chair of the session, Dr. Shibu B. He is the coordinator of IQZ, NMSM Government College, Calcutta. Our chief guest, Dr. Swastha Guha Thakura, and other resource persons. Mr. Biju Abraham, HOD of this department. Mr. Bashir KK, coordinator of the seminar. Dr. Munir Babu, faculty of the Department of Economics, and other faculty members of the department and college. Dear faculties, research scholars, students, all who are participating in this webinar, a warm good morning to all. As mentioned earlier, this is the second online edition of the Ecothought in the current academic year. I am extremely happy about the program since this much of participants from inside the country and from outside the country registered and entered in this platform. I really appreciate the organizers for this effort. Macroeconomic issues are the center of world politics. The macroeconomics are responsible for explaining how the economy as a whole works. In the words of Mankip, The macroeconomics ability to predict the future course of economic event is no better than meteorologists' ability to predict next month's weather. However, the macroeconomics knowledge is useful for explaining the economic events and for formulating economic policies. Regarding this webinar, I think the topics of the keynote address, economic growth in India, a critical perspective, definitely highlight the current economic situations and the shocks that reflecting our growth in the current period. A critical thinking will definitely arises, or it may throw some light on the facts, and it will definitely suggest some remedies also. Mrs. Gobika's presentation, Post-Reform Kerala, Regime of Accumulation and the Development Impact, will familiarize all of you regarding the macroeconomic scenario of Kerala economy, whose development models already appreciated and discussed all over the world. The last presentation, Shraddha Verma, on monetary policy and insurance sector analysis from Indian context, will also analyze the next important macroeconomic areas such as monetary policy debates, etc. And we may expect serious discussion may be arising from these aspects also. So we consider this is a big platform for the economic researchers to present their ideas and findings. To cope up with the needs of time, much more economic thinking is inevitable. Let us hope that the platform will also help for the same. To keep the time, I, with great pleasure and proud, inaugurate this webinar with your consents. Thanks. Thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am. Moving on to the important sessions of the day. Today, we are very fortunate to have one of the eminent personalities, Dr. Shraddha Verma, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Kancharapara College, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. We are very fortunate to have you, sir. He is going to speak on the topic, Economic Growth in India, a Critical Perspective. I invite Dr. Shraddha Verma for the keynote address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. I hope I'm audible. Thank you, Bashir. I also want to thank the organizers and NMSM College. Am I audible, Bashir?
Yes, Ashanu.
Okay, thank you. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for those kind introduction. And as discussed, it is a keynote address, but I shall try my best to keep it very simple. And I'll not present too much of data or something. So I'd like to tell a story in a very lucid manner as much as I can. And if I'm crossing the time limit, please don't hesitate to let me know. And I need to share my screen. I think somebody else's screen is also shared. I'm not sure.
Hello, Biju sir. Biju sir.
Pramila, please mute your audio and video.
Biju sir. Hello, Biju sir.
Can I present my screen? Somebody, I think, is.
Okay, sir, you can continue.
Okay.
She has muted audio.
No, that's okay. I shall present my screen. Let me know if you are able to Okay.
Yes, Bashir?
Can I present my screen? Okay, you can continue. Okay.
Yeah. Are you all able to see the screen?
Yes, sir. You can continue.
Okay. I'll just switch off the camera. Sorry for the technical issues. Yeah. Okay. So as mentioned in the title itself, it's a more of a critical perspective about economic growth in India. So the structure of the presentation is following. In the introductory section, I shall briefly talk about the main argument and the motivation of our discussion today. And then we'll set up the context where we shall refer to the current reality and the emerging growth debate. What I would like to suggest as a critical perspective, and there we shall have three subsections, as you can say, briefly to refer to what kind of methodological positions are influencing this kind of narrative or discussion, and then we should discuss about the various sources of demand and connect it with our main narrative. And then we shall present the big picture, as I would like to call it. After that, we shall conclude with these two segments where I shall refer to the paradigmatic problem and in which direction we could perhaps think of a plausible alternative. Okay. At any point, if any of you are not able to connect to what is going on, you can actually check at the top of the screen. I think you'll be able to understand where we are. And we all understand that having webinar has its own technical constraints. So I thank you all for bearing with me for that. Okay, the main argument of our presentation is that inequality lies at the very heart of India's growth process. Now, generally in macroeconomics, we do not about much about inequality. But as I would like to argue that it has always been and it would always be the very fundamentals of one of the fundamentals of macroeconomics. And in the current scenario, in the post-reform period in particular, inequality is one of the key factors in India's growth process. But at the same time, it is the increasing inequality that also makes India's growth vulnerable. So you can see in one hand where we are saying that inequality could be feeding into the process of growth, but that very thing is kind of making the process vulnerable again. So where lies the problem? In my understanding, the problem lies with the very paradigm of development that we are following. The motivation of this discussion is obvious. India had a very successful growth transition, if you think from its own past, what is known as the Hindu rate of growth, and breaking away from that, and continuing the high economic growth over the period of market-oriented reform. And one must acknowledge the fact that this is quite unique in the sense that whatever we might hear around us or whatever we might read from the books of our textbooks, but if you actually look at the data, not too many developing countries have had successful growth period or transition after introduction of economic reforms, unlike some countries. So somebody like Danny Rodrigue would argue that if there are three countries he had to pick who had grown successfully after introduction of market-oriented reforms, in his opinion, it's India, China, and Vietnam. And he further says that these countries have followed anything but neoliberal paradigm, copybook neoliberal paradigm. Anyway, but that's a different debate. So what I'm trying to say is India presents a very curious case of having a successful growth period over the long run, if you think, after the introduction of reform. Then, as we know, India has also got into what one could say as a transition from growth miracle to growth debacle. Now, the quick overview of the recent macroeconomic conditions would be that there's a steady decline in GDP growth. This is even prior to COVID-19. Obviously, COVID-19 has had its impact. And then there is a deepening agrarian crisis. Our investment growth has also not been very satisfactory. On the other hand, post 2007-8 or the 2008 financial crisis, export growth has not always been very steady. And to make the matter worse, there is a possibility that between 2011 and 2017-18, we might have had actually a decline in real per capita consumption expenditure, which reflects that there may be people, especially in the rural area, might have actually lost their purchasing power or real income. Now, that's a very scary situation. And this is not surprising, given the fact that we have reached a historically high unemployment level. And as you know, the recent reports have also suggested India seems to be a very rich country with a lot of hungry people. One of our respected professors, late Professor A.V. Raja, used to say that India is a rich country with a lot of poor people. And we can also say that India is a rich country with a lot of hungry people. So if you just take a quick look at what Arvind Subramanian would like to call a great slowdown, this is most of the post 2016-17 and especially after 2017-18 third quarter, that you see there's a steady growth deceleration. But prior to that also, after 2013-14, whatever improvement for a little while you saw, that was also very volatile. So there was a volatile recovery after the financial crisis or the global crisis. And then there's a steady growth deceleration. And therefore, no wonder the growth debate is back to town. Earlier, the growth debate was, when did India have a structural break? And then the growth debate became, why has India been growing? And now the growth debate is not been growing or why the growth has slowed down. Now, one of the prominent accounts that have come out is that it is a predominantly a financial crisis. And obviously, there is another camp which says that no, the reform is incomplete and so on and so forth. Now, this camp is a very interesting camp because when there is a growth, this camp would argue the growth is because of the the fact that reforms been implemented. But the moment there is not enough growth or the growth decelerates, this camp would immediately rush to argue, oh, no, that's because the reforms are not really complete. Now, this is a bit weird because this is kind of the typical, understanding of a willpower kind of a story, that if you succeed, you have willpower. If you don't, then you don't have willpower. Now, that's a very tautological argument. The other camp would argue that there are a lot of structural issues, like most of our people are still stuck with agriculture. We have infrastructural problems. We have issues with skill generation and so on. We have problems like corruption. There are institutional problems. And there is another group which argue that, the rising inequality is a matter of concern because this had given enough power with the elites, but the elites in the post-financial crisis era, post-2008, and the recent past particularly have not been doing really well, and that has had an impact. Now, our story is connected in a way to this, but we would like to say that it is a more of a growth inequality nexus. Now, this is, I'm not inventing the term or this phrase. This has already been part of the heterodox camp in the Indian economics, which argue that in one way the growth is leading to rising inequality, and the other way the inequality is feeding into the process of growth. And to understand that, you need to have an understanding of the regime of accumulation. What is the model that you are following? What is the development paradigm that you are following? That what are the processes that underlie the whole process of accumulation? Now, I should like to argue that we look at our discussion in this last school of thought. Now, if you take a longer term narrative, this is not the first time Indian growth has slowed down or fluctuated. Immediately after the introduction of reforms, we had a steady period of growth acceleration, followed by a very unstable growth phase. And then what we had was a period of 4 to 5 years, what R. Nagaraj would like to call a dream run, India's dream run, when we were aiming for double-digit growth, but that was halted by the outbreak of global crisis. And then we had a little period of recovery and then a slowdown. Now, don't misunderstand this as a cyclical process, because these are actually, resultant of the underlying problems of the very model of development that we're following. So let me put it in a very simple way again, that the problem lies in the very model that we are following to grow. So the factors which are adding to grow are actually the factors themselves which are also creating hindrances for the growth process. Now, this is a bit dialectical that way. Okay, so what are the broad theoretical perspectives which influence our discussion today? Obviously, one is the Keynesian approach, because as you will see that we would like to argue from the perspective of the demand. And so our discussion will hover around the importance of the aggregate demand and the various components of aggregate demand, and linking with the larger understanding of Marxian political economy, where you actually pay attention to the class process, the tension between different classes, not necessarily the typical capital versus workers, because there are a lot of segments even within these classes. But then we shall also need to compile this with what Veblen argue as conspicuous consumption, because our argument will also refer to things like elite and non-elite and emulation and consumption growth and so on. And in this regard, we shall also borrow from Eric Olin-Wright's understanding of elite and non-elite. So this is a more of a sociological understanding. So you can see this discussion is very multidisciplinary in that way, and it borrows from various schools of thought. And because, it's difficult just to stick yourself to one particular small box and tell the entire story. Now we are going to talk about the various sources of demand, and we shall try to link with the fact that why inequality is an important factor to understand India's growth process. Now, the first component that we are going to focus today is private consumption. Now, we know that disposable income, wealth, and consumer culture are some of the major determinants of private consumption. India had a very good private consumption growth if you take a long-term look. But then, if income is one of the main determinants, the growth of income also would depend on the earning growth of majority of the population and a good employment growth. But here is the problem. We have in one hand a severe agrarian distress, which we have not really come out of. Most of the people, like 45 to 46%, would be still stuck with the agriculture and other activities. And that is a sector which contributes much less than 20%, maybe something around 14 to 15% of the GDP. So most people are stuck with the sector that is not really growing or not contributing much to overall GDP. And then the non-agricultural sector also, the real wage growth has not been very impressive. And to make the matter worse, the wage inequality is also rising. And on the top of it, we have had, when we had been growing, the growth was jobless. And now the growth has become job loss growth. So earlier we were growing, but we are not creating enough jobs. But now we are growing at a slower rate, or whatever, a little positive, or off late very negative. That's a pandemic situation. But now the growth was, we are growing whatever little amount, but we are losing jobs. So we have moved from jobless growth to job loss growth. Now in this scenario, how do we really understand that consumption growth? So that is why I would like to argue this is where the urban elites class, comprising of the classes of managers, owners, service professionals, and manufacturing professionals, these classes have benefited a lot from the process of economic growth in post-reform India. And what has happened in the process is the inequality has been rising, but these classes have benefited a lot. So obviously they contribute significant consumption growth. And now this is where Veblen's side, because so But as I have already told, given the fact that real wage has not been rising and employment growth has not been very impressive, the only possible route was the availability of loan, the importance of which had been rising over the period of market-oriented reforms. But then again, who can access loans? Not everyone can access loans. And then you can get indebted forever if you're really into that trap. Now you understand that the generation of income is iniquitous. The consumption process, in one hand, is unequal because not everyone has benefited from the process of growth. But on the other hand, because you have the deepening inter-class inequalities, this factor called emulation of the conspicuous consumption of various classes every class tries to emulate the immediate upper class. This process deepens as inequality increases. And that is where you see that the role of credit or debt loan, this becomes very important. So to just summarize what I just said, that the growth pattern is such where private consumption is an important component, but that depends on income, but not everybody has income. The urban elites have benefited significantly, so they have one kind of lifestyle, and that kind of sets the benchmark. That is something that people aspire for, but most people don't have income, so they try to emulate the immediate upper class, in many cases by taking help of loans and credits and so on. So inequality thus becomes a very important factor when we try to understand the consumption growth in India in the reform period. So if you just look at what kinds of consumption has been growing, you can easily understand that something like furniture, furnishing, and then medical care and services, recreation and education, cultural services, and the miscellaneous goods and services. The last category I said all include something like your care, beauty care, your banking services, your insurance fees. So these are some of the components of consumption which has registered a much higher growth over the periods of reform as compared to the pre-reform period. So the blue bar is the 80s decade, and the orange bar is the post-reform between 1999 and 2012-13. This is the average annual growth. And you can easily understand that most of the components that have been growing at a faster rate over the periods of reforms are actually kind of the conspicuous consumption that Veblen would talk about. And I have already discussed in the previous slide that why the elites are important and why the elitist approach to consumption is important, why the emulation, the factor called emulation, is important in the situation where the interclass inequality is rising. Now, that is so far as the consumption story, and you can understand that growing interclass inequality is important to understand and analyze the consumption growth. Let's come to the second important aspect of domestic demand, which is investment. Now, the two major determinants of investments are profit rate and capacity utilization. As you all know, capacity utilization would depend on aggregate demand, and profit rate would depend on, rising productivity and the rising profit share for a given stock of capital. Now, rising productivity is more of a technological route to increase profit rate, and the rising profit share is, I would like to argue, more of a political route. And if one reads Kaleski, this becomes much more clear why increasing profit share is a more political factor. And but these two are also connected. For example, if you invest too much in capital-intensive technology, we displace a lot of labor and their bargaining power reduces. As a result, many of the workers would agree to work at a cheaper rate, and this at a given capital stock would raise the profit share. So these two are not really disconnected from each other, but just for understanding, I have kept them separate. But to increase the profit rate, there's a technological route, which obviously, in a situation where you are investing more and more, and as we know that capital embodies technology, as you invest more in more capital intensive technology to also remain competitive in the global market and to benefit from the whole market process, which definitely leads to more of a monopolization, natural monopoly, oligopoly. That's a different story. So in one hand, rising productivity helps the profit rate and increasing profit share also. So if you actually think of India's investment growth has been is very connected with very much connected with the rising profit share. And on the other hand, the capacity utilization, as I said, depends on domestic demand and global demand. Now, as you can understand, if in a country inequality has been rising, so then one of the most important components of domestic demand, which is consumption, that will not be broad-based. Now, obviously, you actually need to have a very good export growth so as to sustain your aggregate demand, because the domestic demand is not broad-based. Now, just quickly, let's look at the positive correlation between accumulation and profit share. So on the vertical axis, we are measuring accumulation. On the horizontal axis, we are measuring profit share. By accumulation, I mean I by K, investment by capital stock. And let's focus on the second part of the graph. Broadly, I'm calling it capitalist sectors because this is all the sectors minus agriculture and allied activities and public administration and defense. So you can see the decade of 80s is in the southwest corner of the graph, and then clusters keep moving upwards as we move along. So clearly that as profit share rises, accumulation rises. Now this actually validates the kind of story I was trying to tell just before. The link between capital labor inequality. And so if you think of investment, therefore, in one hand, the rising inequality between capital and labor represented through the rising profit share boosts or stimulates investment. On the other hand, the other factor that helps investment or helps increase the profit rate is technology. Now, what technology does? Technology actually creates intra-working class inequality or wage inequality. Now, thus you understand the very process that is helping investment growth is also connected with inequality. But as I argued, that the other important determinants of investment is capacity utilization, of which consumption is a major component, but that is not broad-based because of rising inequality. So export, therefore, becomes very important. But what about government consumption? I'm coming to export in a minute. Government consumption could have become another important source of demand, but as you all know, under the neoliberal regime of accumulation, there is always this pressure of fiscal discipline. But the rules are selectively relaxed. When there is a problem of capital, or the government relaxes its fiscal disciplining rule, but not otherwise. But one of the major components of government consumption is compensation of government employees. But we all know that government as an employer has reduced its importance over the years. Even in the public sector, you have seen increasing informalization, increasing contractual jobs, and so on and so forth. So the domestic demand consumption is not broad-based. The government consumption is always under pressure. And as I just said, that because the government has reduced its importance as an employer, that also negatively affects the demand creation. Therefore, export becomes critical for the growth to sustain in the long run. So to have a steady export growth, you understand the global demand becomes a significant factor in the whole story. But that is the reason that external crisis can become very destabilizing. We know that, for example, in the late 90s, we had an East Asian crisis. In the post-2007-8, we had the global crisis. And the moment these global slowdowns happen, India's growth always get hampered. But then as long as your domestic demand can take care of that, you can balance it. That is how India had been going, through from one ups and another downs to another up like that. But this cannot go on because the recent situation shows you that even the domestic demand is not really able to take care of the process. And then global politics enters the picture. Nowadays, that some leaders would say, no, we will not allow this, we will not allow that. This has become a serious matter of serious concern. So just to put it all together, okay, to present the big picture. So free market policies has been aggravating the agrarian crisis. Therefore, it releases a lot of cheap labor from the rural areas. And it also resulted in sluggish growth in remunerative employment. and led to increasing informalization, and you have increasing profit share and wage inequality. What happens in the process as therefore the inequality rises? The class of urban elites benefits a lot. And the whole private consumption growth is very elitist in nature and debt dependent. Thus, you can understand that the process is generating inequality, which is kind of giving a feedback into the process of growth. On the other hand, the investment growth is also dependent on other kind of interclass inequality between labor and capital. And since technology benefits productivity and profit rate, and technology is something that also increases intra-working class inequality or intra-labor inequality, increasing wage inequality. And that gives a feedback to the, again, creation of the urban elites and so on, because not all the segments of working class is benefiting. Some are able to join the camps of the urban elites. Now, in this situation, the global demand becomes very important, but because of global crisis, there is a problem. And as I argue, the government should have been more proactive, but they're doing everything else, but not that. So in a way, the government is doing things that would actually reinforce this growth inequality nexus. And it is in this scenario that the pandemic hits us. We have come to almost the end of our discussion. This is a schematic presentation of what I just said. The growth leads to a certain kind of urbanization, which is built on exclusive, which is based on creation of exclusive spaces, and there is a certain way of living within the urban, economy. But it is the elitist way, and the elite can afford to. But the rest of the classes try to emulate, and they get into the debts and so on. This also leads to an increasing urban-rural inequality and intra-urban and interclass inequality. So this is built on the process of inequality. Now, what it does, it one hand boosts the conspicuous consumption growth and the increasing urban-rural gap, the continuing agrarian crisis leads to this whole, maintains this whole reserve army of cheap labor, which actually helps creating more of informal labor and so on, informal economy. And don't get yourself misled by the thought that the formal and informal economy are not related. You can see a very much of a formal economy where the informal workers are working. So think of a corporate building where you have contractual stuff. So the formal economy and informal economy are very much tied into. So this actually helps the process of accumulation and the process of growth in return. But that is exactly where the problem begins, because this kind of a regime would always have a demand situation, because the domestic demand is not broad-based. You have to rely on the global demand, but that cannot go on for long, because globally also this structural problem continues. And the moment there is a global crisis, you get into a problem. To make the matter worse, the current regime has done the following, and I'm not going to detailed discussion of this. We had demonetization, we had GST. We really do not know, and that is where in one of my slides, I put a question mark beside reality. We really do not know reality. Now, there's a lot of controversy around the GDP calculation itself. Now, this is also very problematic for the government itself. If the government does not know the reality, how will the government take care of the reality? And the government is very much willing to dilute the labor law in post-pandemic scenario. The policy announcements are a bit fuzzy in some cases, because this whole 20 lakh crore package, which was supposedly 10% of the GDP, we know that it is at the most going to be, in real sense, not more than 3% of the GDP. And in this whole globalization context, thinking of an Atmanirbhar globalized India or globalized Bharat would be more of an oxymoron. Because if you really think of following a more of a station kind of policy, you really need to focus on your domestic demand. And to address that, you have to address the problem of agriculture, rural sector. You have to generate a lot of employment. You have to ensure real wage for the most of the population is growing, or the most of the labor class is an oxymoron, in my opinion. So situation has become worse. We know the post-pandemic situation. Now we are about to conclude our discussion today. I would like to argue, to end the discussion, that we are in a paradigmatic problem. When Friedrich Hayek was criticizing the whole planned regime, and he said the road to serfdom, he said if you allow the free market capitalism, things will be taken care of. quite interestingly, where has it brought us? For the last 30, 40 years, we have been following what the whole globe has been following what the neoliberal camp, the Hayek, the Friedmans of the world would argue, the free market capitalism. We are moving towards that. And the idea was, through that, it will lead to more liberal and freer society. And just take a look at the Democracy Report of 2020. It has been recently released. After 30, 40 years of neoliberalism globally, we are in a situation of surging autocracy. Now, the autocracy, the rise in the autocratization, in one hand, in the growing resistance, this is not just the story of one country in particular. It across countries that this is a serious concern. Now, this is where, this poses a very important research question. We have moved from the road to serfdom to road to autocracy. Now, is it a road to endgame? We do not know the future. Let's not really predict there, but this is a very serious problem. Now, the economic crisis, in a way, in my opinion, is actually a crisis of economics. When the entire neoliberalism was growing and the free market policies were being promoted, the Washington Consensus was being promoted, it was argued that there is no alternative, the famous TINA syndrome. But then after a few years, as critics could see what was the problem, the critics argued, this is no alternative. But then, what has been happening? This is not surprising. This is not odd. This is not something that you do not expect from this kind of model. This is logical. This is quite obvious that the outcomes of this model would be this. But then there is another TINA, which is the truth is never absolute. And therefore, there is always new alternatives. So that is another TINA. So we have a journey from TINA to TINA. This is a TINA syndrome that economists are not really free from. So finally, what really matters? Jagdish Bhagwati and Panagaria wrote a book named Why Growth Matters. I would argue that, the main argument is, yes, development is growth plus something. So to develop, you need to grow. Let's turn the table very carefully. What we are arguing, we are saying, if you say that you need to grow so as to develop, actually you need to develop so as to grow, and so that you can develop further. So what becomes central is development. Growth is a means, it's not an end, but even to achieve that means, you need to have certain kind of developments. So you need a economic decentralization, but not of the neoliberal kind, because when they say free market, let's not get fooled. It actually, in reality, is imperfect competition, oligopoly, cartels, some monopolistic competition. So we need more of a cooperative model of development. We need a democracy at work, and one of the experiments could be to experiment with cooperation and cooperatives as opposed to corporation. So we need more of a democracy at work. We need political decentralization and participatory democracy, and we must put nature at the center. It cannot be that it is human-centric. It has to be nature-centric. Because once I heard Akhil Bilgrami arguing that both Gandhi and Marx had something interesting to say about nature. Apparently, their thesis of both of them led to this kind of an argument that humans have moved from considering themselves to be part of nature, or how do humans consider nature? Nature, they don't consider nature as something that they live in. They consider nature as something that they can have control upon. And that's a very dangerous approach to follow. You have to be in sync with the nature. I think we, the humans, are this rare species in the whole on the whole earth, that we are not really in sync with nature. We are anti-nature in many possible ways. And capitalism is definitely anti-nature by the very model of it. So what we need is development for liberation. And that's where I would like to end my discussion today. Thank you so much for your patience and giving me time.
Thank you, sir. It was really a nice presentation. It was really nice to listen to you. Thank you for such an eloquent, very systematic and informative talk on the economic growth in India. We will have the QA session only after the coming 2 sessions. Moving on to the first session of the day. We have an idealistic personality, Mrs. Gobika Gigi, Assistant Professor, Department of Economic, University College Trivandrum. She is going to have the presentation on the topic Post-Reform Kerala, Regime of Accumulation and its Developmental Impacts. I call on Mrs. Gobika Gigi to have her presentation. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. And I want to thank the department and the college for giving me this opportunity. So, yeah, let's start. And thank you, Dr. Shashdu, for that wonderful presentation and for sharing this intense ideas on national economy. And I hope I'm audible. So, can I start?
Sure, ma'am.
Thank you. So this is actually a work in progress. So I'm expecting all of your comments and valuable suggestions to improve my work. I would be talking about post-reform Kerala, and I'm trying to identify a regime of accumulation and its developmental impacts for the economy and the society, I would say, actually. So briefly, this is how I will proceed. I want to introduce you to the lens I'm using here. Regulation theory, especially I would be making use of the insights from French regulation theory because it's a broader area and I'm not going to do the details and specificities. So insights that would be used. And I'm trying to identify two regimes for the state. Like one is a redistributive state-led regime which prevailed in the state until 70s. And I'm going to argue that, and it's not my argument, it's already established by various scholars, there was a crisis in Kerala economy during late 70s and 80s, which was caused by multiple factors. But until now, people were identifying it as a macroeconomic crisis rather than as a crisis in the regime of accumulation itself. I will tell you what I mean by regime of accumulation. So I identify that crisis we already know that happened in Kerala economy as a crisis of the regime. And what happened in Kerala economy after like 80s? Okay, 80s was kind of a turnaround for the entire society and economy. And I'm trying to see the features of the current regime where I know there are various detailed features, but here I will be looking into two major things. One is like how the current regime is making or the current reproduction of the system is depending on a class compromise that already took place in the state, and about how we are making use of the commons or the natural resources in an indiscriminate manner. That's why I'm calling it predatory capital. And then I will just try to think about the challenges we are facing right now. So first of all, let's see what is a regime of accumulation. Okay, we all know that capitalist system has got its own inherent contradictions, and Dr. Shashto was actually mentioning about how we can look at it. Okay, so rather than just looking at the aggregate concepts, we can identify a pattern of production and consumption in any system, in a national system, and that is what is more sensible. But here I am attempting to see for a regional system, that is for Kerala. And this approach has its own very limitations because Kerala is not an independent sovereign country with its own trade policies and all, but still we can identify some specific features of a regime. That's what. So this is what is a regime? It is a pattern of production and consumption that is temporarily sustainable. Okay, why it is called temporarily? This temporary doesn't mean for 5 years or 10 years. This is about decades. As we know in the history of capitalist accumulation or the capitalist development, every time the system get into some or the other crisis, the capitalist accumulation itself get into a crisis. And as we know, the Great Depression or later on the stagflation, many things. Okay, so then the system adapt and find a new method to come out of it. And how it is being happened, because the effective demand and the supply should be adjusted according to the crisis, and the adaptation shall take the system out of the crisis. So there would be some forms of regulations which are actually sets of both explicit and implicit norms. Okay, we know if consumers are still feudal, the capital system cannot sell its commodities. Okay, so that way the implicit and explicit norms, then the institutions and rules, where government policies, etc., it all changed according to the regime of accumulation. Okay, so when a regime of accumulation enters into a crisis or a system of production and related consumption, when it enters into crisis, there would be a way the system, like how Fordism came. That is how the regulation theory introduced the concept itself. So when wage extraction or when the surplus generation exceed a point, and when there is when it start affecting the consumer demand or the aggregate effective demand, the capitalists are ready to share a part of their surplus with the consumers, because they want to generate aggregate demand in the economy, or like through mass consumption they want to continue. Like Dr. Shraddha was mentioning, productivity and technology, by increasing productivity or through like making use of technological advances, or through in plain words exploiting laborers only, this can be continued. But then the demand side is need to be taken care of. That's what. Okay, so why am you making use of this specific approach? Because regulation approach acknowledges the existence of contradictory social relations within economic activities. This is very important, because in our macroeconomic classes we hardly talk about this. Okay, we talk about consumers, we talk about producers, and we talk about the issue in effective demand and all. But we hardly look into the relations that exist beyond that, because when there is a problem in demand, it could be about the existing social relations that come out as a result of the production and production relations. So regulation theory actually helps us to acknowledge the existence of this contradictory social relations, which are very important for an economy. And this regime of accumulation is the configuration of social relations, okay, that constitute the prevailing form of capitalism. We know that capitalism was not existing in the same exact way from 1930s onwards. It was changing, and it is still changing and adapting. So according to the needs of the current form of capitalism, social relations need to be reconfigured. Then only the system can reproduce itself. Okay, for the until the next crisis. Okay, it's not like it will continue infinitely, but until the next crisis, the system can go on like this only if there is kind of a configuration. Sorry, and it indicates the systematic and long-term allocation of the product of economic activity. Okay, that is why in Fordism they were ready to share a good amount with the consumers. Okay, then only there can be a continuation in the conditions of production and consumption. As we know, surplus generation is a requirement, but at the same time there would be a demand side like support for the system. So there need to be a rearrangement in the entire system or the configuration. And now there is something called a mode of regulation. Okay, and what is a mode? This is very simplistic form, and I'm not actually giving you the exact details of the very in-depth, like this regulation approach itself is a detailed one, and it is intense. I'm just taking some very brief insights from that. Okay, so one thing we need to remember is we cannot miss the way the laws and agents' behavior change over the period. If you actually look into your economy, or if you just see how it is changing over the period, we know that the state is not behaving in the same way. The households, like we, the consumers, we are not behaving in the same way, and the firms are also not. So there is this behavioral change for the agents in the economy and for the regulations and laws in the economy, and this change actually come about in order to deal with the crisis that arise in the system. Okay, so following a crisis, in Kerala's case, I'm going to say that this crisis happened in the late 70s. Okay, so following such a crisis, definitely there would be a compromise among the agents in order to resolve the crisis and continue with the capitalistic reproduction. If the system is ready to like kind of throw away the capitalistic reproduction, okay, then it is an entirely different case. But we know that now we do not have such an option. Now what is happening is the capitalistic reproduction is continuing in its different ways. So when surplus generation is in a crisis, there should be some kind of a compromise between the agents. The agents means the workers, the producers, the government, and households, firms, and all. Okay, and how this mode of regulation change take place in an economy is, if you look at the habits of individuals or the institutions within the economy, there would be certain changes that is taking place in their habits or in the institutions and the way the institutions behave in the economy in line with the needs of prevailing or the new regime of accumulation. Okay, so according to the needs of the new regime of accumulation, we as consumers and government or even the firms, they all would be ready to get into new forms of they would be ready to incorporate new changes in our behavior. Okay, and what are these changes look like? As we know, the wage relations, okay, and the market relations, and even gender relations. And this is important actually. We hardly recognize how the gender relations changed from feudalism to capitalism. Like we think suddenly we all were ready to send our women to offices and schools as part of liberation. No, there was an equal pressure from the change in regime of accumulation. See, when there was a need for more workers in the system, the gender relations also changed. I think this make you understand what I mean by this. Okay, so all these relations actually change according to the. I know this looks a bit deterministic, but let's continue like this. So according to the requirements of a specific regime of accumulation, generally all these institutions would be changing. Okay, and the set of such behavioral patterns and institutions together are called as the mode of regulation. Okay, so there would be a change in mode of regulation in order to facilitate and in order to overcome a crisis in economy being through. And now let's look into what happened in Kerala. As all of us know, Kerala was following a different path with all the limitations of being a provincial state within a federal system. Okay, so I'm not arguing that Kerala has got its own regime of accumulation or it was independent from all the things happening in the national economy. No, I'm not arguing that. But what I'm saying is, given the space of a provincial state within the Indian federal system, the state was clearly moving on a different path before 80s. Okay, and it has various reasons. As we said, political, social, economic reasons are there. And I'm going to look into some very significant things that happened. First, one major thing was the first communist ministry that came in Kerala in 57, they were actually trying to move forward with a different kind of approach to the economic reproduction of the economic system. Okay, they were not so keen on continuing with a capitalistic accumulation led regime, that is by favoring surplus generation or by facilitating the conditions for capital to make more surplus. That was not their political or the economic aim. How can we understand that? Because the first government, the first elected government that came into power, the first laws passed were two kind of revolutionary laws. One was Kerala Agrarian Relations Bill and the second one was Kerala Education Bill. And both of these laws were against the interest of the then prevailing dominant class. Okay, the landowning groups and the dominant class. So this is a rare case. Okay, generally the state, especially in a parliamentary democracy, a state hardly take up a stand against the accumulation process. But here we know, due to the specific political reasons, that the Communist Party, they tried to take a different path, which clearly we know that will not be facilitating a capitalist accumulation further. But we know it was not smooth. Actually, the federal system intervened and there was even the government got dissolved. But still, until 70s, the Communist Party within Kerala, they were trying to put forward this redistributive agenda through political activities, even though they couldn't do it massively through their state, as part of state, through political activities, they were pushing forward for that. So even when the other governments were coming, it was not easy for them to step back from this specific redistributive state-led kind of a regime. And that is what is reflected in the high public expenditure on health and education and the extension of welfare state activities and so many things which were actually reducing the inequality within Kerala. But at the same time, the story has a very interesting another dimension, which we all know. And by and it is interesting when we look in a historical way, because see, by late 70s, Kerala became a hot topic in development discourse, because it came out that the state had a different path of development trajectory with low economic growth and very high social development. But interestingly, when globally the state was acknowledged for its unique development trajectory, in reality within the state, that specific regime was actually approaching a serious crisis. Okay, so in academia, when it was celebrated and made so famous by very prominent people, in reality, within the state, actually, there were so many criticisms against this high social development accompanied with low economic growth. And this is where I am identifying not the crisis of Kerala model of development, not the so-called Kerala model of development, but what I'm going to focus into the crisis in the regime of accumulation. Okay, so one main reason I'm identifying is the way Communist Party changed from 57 to 70s. Actually, they were ruling the state, but at the same time, they were attempting to transform the property relations. Okay, like land relation, wage relation and all, they were attempting, but I don't say that it was a clear case or they were 100% truthful or they had the political will. I'm not saying that, but still the regime had a major feature of redistribution, okay, which is quite different from various other, a national scenario then. But as I told you, by late 70s, it got under severe pressures. And there were various reasons for that. One major reason, as we know, the national economy was going through a change. As we said, the early reforms started by 80s. So clearly the state had to address that. But other than that, within the system, actually, there were various other reasons. Okay, one thing is like the Communist Party itself was facing issues and it got divided into two, and the coalition politics actually had its own take on how they want the regime to work further, and the dominant classes started getting an upper hand in the policy regulations. Another thing was the financial burden, the high public expenditure without sufficient revenue generation. We should remember this, because why there was no sufficient revenue generation is connected to the capitalistic reproduction. As we know, capital can reproduce in that smooth way, either through enhancing productivity, which actually got challenged in Kerala, because we know labor, which many scholars call as militant labor unionism and all. But I am not taking any position on that. But what I'm saying is labor was quite strong in Kerala and they had their own share in the total distribution. And they had, this is actually in literature, they discuss about the number of working days factories lost, and capital faced a lot of issues due to this trade unionism, because they were getting a good share. So clearly that was eating into the profit and the surplus the capitalist class could make. Okay, so, and the state, given that scenario in a capitalistic system, the state also was facing a revenue crunch. And another thing was the Gulf boom and migration remittances. Actually, the laborers from Kerala, they were, Gulf boom happened during that time, and the migration, from all the places it happened in Kerala also, that actually triggered a lot of changes within the economy also. One hand, due to trade unionism and also due to this kind of a change in the system, the wages were increasing substantially, okay? And the industrial development was quite disappointing, and the economic stagnation became severe by 70s, like the late 70s. Hence, this regime of accumulation, which was actually a low accumulation regime, because that was not stressing on more surplus generation, but it was more focused on kind of a redistributive regime. But I'm not saying that this was like a do or die situation, because if the state could move to some other trajectory, like maybe through cooperatives or through some radical as in like institutionally radical method of reproduction of the economic system, then it would have been possible. But unfortunately, due to the changed political and economic situations and considering the national scenario, that was not possible. Okay, that is why the system had to reach a dead end for the redistributive regime. And the crisis, this is the crisis I'm identifying here, this severe crisis for the capitalistic reproduction actually becomes severe, and hence the state was forced to move to the next phase. Okay, and let's just see how scholars are identifying the change in the internal structure. Okay, on the one hand, as it was well established by 90s, Kerala was not an interested place for the private capital. Okay, facing the competition from other states, Kerala was considered as a least preferred place for private capital to come in, even domestic capital or even foreign capital. That was a distant dream for the state. And the insight we need to take from this specific regime understanding is that lack of interest of private capital in Kerala can be seen by the logic of returns to capital. See, the capital is not making surplus. The capital is not being able to exploit the maximum and then reinvest. Okay, that is the process how capitalist system kind of reproduce. That was not taking place easily in Kerala. So clearly the private capital was hesitant to enter. And another thing was, which I will be referring to as cheap labor in the following session, following PowerPoints, but I want to make it clear that cheap labor not in the Indian standard. Okay, in the national scenario, the wages in Kerala are still higher and better, but considering to what it is in Kerala, like in Kerala, there was a better standard set for the wage and labor laws and regulation and all. It all got compromised. Okay. So the migrant workers, they started getting recruited by contractors and subcontractors, and their wage rates were much lesser. And interestingly, this was with the support of the state and the political parties. Okay, so the minimum wage laws apparently didn't cover them during that period, and due to a class compromise, that I will talk about that in the coming slide, due to a class compromise reached between the laborers and the capital, because as the capital was facing an issue in reproduction, even the laborers agreed to kind of a compromise. And this the coming of migrant workers and their condition is part of that. That is why even the communists in Kerala were least concerned about the migrant laborers. So their condition was kind of accommodated into the system because we wanted some comparatively cheap labor for the reproduction. And land, what happened to land is the agrarian feudal relations changed, and to an extent land reforms were successful, and as a result agrarian relations were totally changing, and the agricultural reproduction was not happening massively except for plantation sector and all. So then land was actually got converted into a speculative and basically into an asset, and later on into a speculative asset. So rather than a means of production, or rather than using it as productive asset, this is how land later got treated in Kerala. So all this has its own impact on the post-80s regime that evolved in Kerala. As I said, liberalization had its own impact, and we can see that in post-80s, economic growth was, before 80s, Kerala was lagging behind the national average and other states' average, but after 80s, we can see that Kerala was moving ahead. Also inequality, like Shraddha was saying, inequality was also increasing during this period. And these are the features of how economy functioned after 80s. Okay, and very importantly, as we know, it was service sector that led the growth. And there is one thing about the service sector-led growth. Clearly, the service sector-led growth was benefited from the previous investments in human capital. Clearly, our public investment in health and education helped the state to benefit the maximum from the service sector. But at the same time, in 90s and 2000s, when service sector was our kind of growth puller kind of a thing, then we wanted infrastructure, because Kerala was lagging behind in terms of various infrastructure, except for the private infrastructure we were making, because following the Gulf boom, private construction was actually evolving like anything. People were building, they were investing in durable asset like houses. Okay, but public infrastructure was not so impressive for Kerala. So when there was a regime change in late 80s and in 90s, the state wanted to expand the infrastructure. Then only even service sector can thrive on. And that is what took us to the, or that is what else, that's a major feature of the new regime. Okay. And before that, let me remind you, what do we mean it? What do we mean by all this? The existing social relations kind of are determined by the compromise made among the social forces. Okay. So, as Patrick Heller argued, we can see that the organized left actually adopted a class compromise and adaptive strategy, because the industrial stagnation was there, revenue crunch was there. So kind of a class compromise was there, because laborers, if Malayalis remember, we still refer about the this protest against computerization and all. So there was a protest against mechanization and computerization and all the labor replacing technologies. But later, you know what, there happened a kind of a class compromise, because without allowing capital to kind of reproduce in its own way, the entire system cannot move beyond that crisis. So then what happened is, like, both the capitalists and laborers accepted to certain rules, and then it continued. And this regime is specific because it was led not mainly by the enhancement in productivity, but mostly it was led by the increase in consumption demands. Okay, so. And as I was mentioning, as service sector was booming, construction had a significant role in pushing the entire growth ahead. Because from 80s onwards, construction was one of the push factors of economic growth. And if we look at the contribution of construction sector, it is actually more than even the contribution of entire primary sector, and even more than manufacturing sector contribution. So. Construction sector actually became one of the determinant factors that could affect how the economy is. I'm not forgetting about service sector, but what I'm saying is service sector was also kind of dependent on, because we know when the port is coming, we need, for a port, we need more public infrastructure for national highways, and various resource conflicts over the period was also about this thing, because we wanted expansion of service sector, we want more hotels, more resorts and all, but then for that we needed construction. We needed to construct more infrastructure, both private and public infrastructure first. So, and now as it became a major sector in the economy, it got, and how it thrived over the period. Okay, as I already told you, two things happened during this period. One thing is like the private capital that was going to service sector and also to construction, they were looking upon the commons, natural resource commons that were kind of comparatively cheaper for them. Because if you're looking across Kerala, many malls or the industrial like the infrastructure that came, at many places it is by encroaching the public land. Okay, that is like the commons. The commons got encroached to a great extent, and this natural resource management in Kerala was lacking a lot of things like sustainability principle, transparency was majorly missing, and accountability was again a problem. And this we can see was manifesting in various struggles. Okay, not just environmental struggles. Even policy recommendations got politically hijacked. If you remember, even the kind of recommendations regarding protection of the environmental resource of the state got politically hijacked over the period. I'm not going to the detail, but what I'm saying is like this was one source, like sand mining across Kerala, which later got regulated due to various factors, and quarrying that I will be discussing in the next slide. So this encroachment into public resources or commons was a major feature of this regime, and it was very difficult to challenge this, because if we are challenging, it would mean we are kind of prohibiting, or we are kind of stopping the process of accumulation. Okay. And demand side, what happened is like as agents, we know all of us want more and more houses. Even if we have one house, we want to construct one more house. So this demand side pressure was always there. Even those people who are protesting against a quarry, they would be building their own houses. So demand side pressure from both private and public construction side was there. So hence that facilitated the mode of regulation to work the way it wanted. Okay, so it can be easily seen by the expansion of illegal quarries. If you really check the data, we can see that number of illegal of corruption or what we say chronic capitalistic traits. But because without that, the system cannot reproduce. Because when construction, if you remember the recent floods or landslides, within 1 or 2 weeks, actually the government interfered and said, okay, quarries can restart working, because it was actually intervening into the entire economic process. When the construction gets stuck, a huge sector is getting stuck. So the system cannot allow that to happen. The closure of small-scale quarries actually it lead to shortage of construction material, and that actually affect the economy a lot. So this is one feature, okay, how the commons extraction and the natural resource extraction, and especially without paying enough, because most of the illegal quarries are like they are quarrying from the public land, or sand mining is also happening the same way. So that is like extraction of the commons. And the second feature is the repercussions of the class compromise. We can see that after 90s, the number of industrial disputes actually got reduced, and we know now we know even if there is a hartal or strike, we want certain institutions to work beyond any strike, beyond even a national strike. We want certain sectors, for example, like IT. We don't want it to get hurt, or tourism. Why? Because we want that class compromise to function, then only this reproduction can take place. The capitalistic reproduction can take place. In two ways this happened in Kerala. One is like the massive informalization, especially in service sector. And if you remember, in recent past, there were so many strikes from the informal sector, like private nurses strike and the saleswomen in textile shops, they were striking for the right to sit. Okay, so this way, the labor relations were changing in the service sector. And especially in construction sector, what happened is, as we know, the migrant laborers, they are being the source of cheap labor for us, cheap in the state standard, like, because whatever wages they are offered in state is still higher than the national average. But considering the state regime, we can say that the class compromise that reached between trade unions or the labor and capital in the state is state want to facilitate this specific reproduction to continue. So these two features are there. And why does it matter for us to know this is what is happening? Because right now, as we know, without recognizing this is the feature of our current regime of accumulation, we will not be able to identify the problems that it is having. One major, I'm just concluding, so I'm reminding you what I was saying. The long-run capital accumulation pattern was in a crisis in late 70s, and the stagnation happened during 75-87, and then there was a change in the regime. Okay, so the various challenges for reproducing both productive and social relations due to the redistributive reforms of the pre-70s era got us into kind of a crisis. So then there was a change, and the new regime, which was mainly led by service sector, and especially I want to mention construction sector, it has these two features. One is like it's kind of excessive extraction of commons or natural resources, and second one is the exploitation of the cheap labor. And the state is facilitating it by amending the environmental regulation things and also the labor thing. If you remember, very recently we had a law saying like if the immigrant workers, interstate immigrant workers, even if they're having COVID, they can work in their sites if they are asymptomatic. This is the peak. I don't want to explain it any further. Okay. Then they had to change it because public health department intervened. So this is the stage where we have reached now, and it has got a lot of implications. Because the social relations are changing in this way and the state is accepting it, but it is not like it can continue indefinitely. Its social repercussions would be there, and environmental, the limit to growth thing is already affecting us, if we know. Because in 2018 and 19, we know, I'm not saying that all those climatic change things are related to this specific local regime of accumulation, but my point is, we know that when such a pandemic or a calamity affect us, the entire thing gets stuck, and we can see that this cannot be dealt without identifying the specific features of the current regime of accumulation. I am sorry if I exceeded the time. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for a detailed and impressive presentation. We need more time to discuss such topic, but in a webinar, we can provide you only limited time. So even though you have made a very detailed presentation, thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. We will have the QA session only after the next presentation by Shraddha Verma. We are moving on to the second presentation. Today we have an esteemed personality, Mrs. Shraddha Verma, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Maitrey College, Delhi University. She is going to speak on the topic Monetary Policy and Insurance Sector, Analysis from Indian Context. I invite Mrs. Shraddha Verma to have the presentation. Over to you, ma'am.
Good morning, all. Hope I am audible to all.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And first of all, I want to congratulate the entire organizing team, and as well as thank you them that they have given me this opportunity to discuss this interesting aspect of linking monetary policy and insurance sector. So without further ado, I'll just directly jump on to the discussion. Let me just introduce the title is that it is the monetary policy and insurance sector. We're going to understand the link between these two important dimensions of the structure of any economy. And then we're going to analyze how it has been actually evolving over the period of time. So this is a whole paper that I'm sharing with you. I thought to have the insights detailing coming from the entire paper instead of having any PPT for that. I hope my screen is also visible to all of them.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so here is the introduction that I'm starting with. As we all know that the authority to control or to manage the monetary policy in Indian economy is Reserve Bank of India, the central bank. And the main objective of the monetary policy, it aims at actually regulating the level of money in the economy with certain objectives in front of it. And those objectives include mainly like price stability, full employment, balanced economic growth, maintaining your foreign exchange reserves, etc. And RBI takes the charge of controlling the level of money supply in India and to ensure that there is enough liquidity flow in the economy to actually reach to those goals which it had actually in its process. In the whole process of maintaining the stable growth in the economy, monetary policy does affect several factors or several sectors in the economy for that matter. So herein the idea is that while processing its structure and its actually idea of reaching to its goal, monetary policy does affect several sectors: agriculture, service, finance, capital, credit, debt market, few to name out here, and most importantly, insurance sector. And that is the main aspect of the discussion here. Insurance sector is one of the very relevant pillars of the economy, which contributes not only towards the social and the financial security of the people, but it also helps in managing the financial status of the country. We're going to discuss it later. Monetary policy actually affect this particular part of the country, that is the insurance sector, in a very strategic manner. And I'm going to just give you a hint about that, how it does affect. Then we're going to go into the detailing later on, because monetary policy has a major and a direct impact on the interest rates and as well as the prices existing in the economy. And through this aspect, it turns out that it does affect the insurance sector very effectively. Before we directly jump on to the link between insurance and monetary policy, we're going to just understand that what has been the framework of monetary policy in India. Monetary policy has a very important role in structuring process of the economy. And the main objective of monetary policy is to maintain the stability in the process of economic growth. And RBI focuses on fulfilling this objective through various tools at its disposal, namely like reserve ratio, discount rate, open market operations, so and so forth, etc. RBI strategically works in the direction of achieving stability in the prices of the goods just give me 1 minute. I think I have lost the network connectivity. I'll just going to share my screen again. So RBI actually helps in maintaining that stability in the prices of the good, maintaining that the highest possible level of employment is achieved, and the maximum production or output level is actually maintained with the foreign exchange reserves in stable mode, and obviously maintaining that there is equal distribution of the income also existing in the economy. So with all these objectives and with all the tools available at its disposal, monetary policy goes ahead in making sure that all these things are actually maintained simultaneously, which is a very tough job to call out. Now, we were just discussing about what are the tools available with the monetary policy, or basically RBI. So let's have a detailed understanding of all those also. Basically, there are two main instruments available at the disposal of RBI to implement monetary policy. And the first one is qualitative measures and the second one is quantitative measures. We'll go into the detailing of every kind of measure that we have so that it can help us to discuss the link of this policy with insurance sector. Under qualitative tools, there are mainly two aspects through which RBI manages the money supply. The first is credit rationing and the second is moral suasion. Credit rationing basically helps in managing the speculations, especially in the stock market. So RBI has a complete authority to maintain that lending margin, and thus it actually works according to the need of the market economy. So with using this credit rationing as a tool, it helps in stabilizing and uniformizing the speculations which are possible in the stock market. And let me just tell you that when you have huge speculations, then actually it creates actually a disturbance in the balance of, or you can say balance of money supply. So here is a need that there has to be speculation, but it has to be within the range which is actually conducive for the growth of the economy. And obviously, while maintaining the lending margin, RBI also maintains that there is an upper limit that it can actually work on to create for the level of credit. So it maintains that it actually have the authority to create that level of credit, the upper limit to that, so that it can be the limit to which the banks can actually lend to the entire market. So through all these lending margins, through credit rationing, creating the upper limit, through all these ways, RBI tends to control the value of the bank credit flowing into the economy. The next aspect or the next tool in the list of the qualitative measure is moral suasion. It's basically a moral way of convincing and approaching the banks to control the level of credit instead of actually having any pressurizing aspect on them. So herein the central bank actually, have a moral discussion and make them convinced about the situation of the economy, and then they proceed ahead to work out their plan for the lending amount. Moving on to the quantitative aspects. Herein we're going to now discuss that what are the tools under the quantitative measures that RBI generally uses. The first is open market operations. Open market operations basically as an aspect wherein RBI sells or buys the government securities in open market, depending upon the need of the liquidity in the economy. So if suppose the economy is in need of a higher liquidity, then RBI tends to buy the government securities from the people or from the organizations possessing them. So in this way, RBI tends to buy the government securities and provide the money to the people or organizations or any institution for that matter. In this way, RBI helps in actually injecting the new liquidity flow in the economy, and it does vice versa when it tends to sell the government security. So that is one way. The second tool is your discount rate or bank rate. In discount rate or bank rate, basically this is an interest rate at which the commercial banks takes up the loan from the central bank, and by controlling this rate, RBI manages the level of credit flow. So what does it happen is that if suppose the economy is not in a need of the liquidity flow, means there is already too much of credit flowing, then RBI needs to control that. So in that case, RBI will going to increase the bank rate so that if suppose commercial banks end up taking the loan from the central bank, actually taking up a lesser amount of loan given a huge rate of interest that they had to pay back. So with this, banks will going to have a lesser amount of credit flowing into them, and thus they can actually flow out lesser amount of credit in the form of loans into the market. This is how RBI tends to manage the credit flow using the discount rate or bank rate. And last two are the cash reserve ratio and statutory liquidity requirements. I think again we are pretty aware of their working, but still I'll just going to have a brief discussion about these two. Actually, cash reserve ratio is that percentage of the total deposits of the bank that has to be kept as cash with RBI. And secondly, statutory liquidity requirement is another kind of a reserve that banks have to maintain with RBI only, but with the way that RBI expects the banks to keep these certain part of the deposits with it, then it is actually, you can say controlling the security of the banking system and their financial status. So now if suppose monetary policy requires that there has to be increase in money supply in the economy, then RBI would going to lower down CRR or SLR as per the requirement. So with this way, it actually provides more money to be flowing into the banks and then in turn into the market. So this is how RBI tends to control two aspects, that is CRR and SLR, in managing the level of money supply. And lastly, we have repo rate and reserve repo rate. Repo rate or reserve repo rate are again certain kind of interest rate that exist when commercial banks borrow money from RBI or lends to it in exchange of the government securities as and when situation needed. So as again, we have understood that these are the interest rates that exist when commercial banks are actually borrowing or lending from RBI. So now herein it tends to actually control, means RBI tends to control these kind of rates depending upon the requirement in the economy. So if the economy is in a need of a higher money supply, then RBI can use repo rate or reserve repo rate to actually go down, so that once repo rate goes down, the commercial banks can borrow more money from the RBI. And then if suppose the reserve repo rates goes down, then commercial banks are can lend more money from the RBI. So this is how the structure of the quantitative measures of RBI works in. Let's understand that how monetary policy has evolved over these years. RBI Act 1934 was also underwent an amendment in 2016. Actually, it was noted that the Act of 1934 requires an amendment according to the changing dynamics of the economy, and most importantly, the changing interrelation of the Indian economy with the rest of the world. So because of this, that has been the main objective of this amendment in 2016. It was noted that after independence, the role of RBI was in line with the planning process of the nation, especially with regard to the 5-year plan undertaken by the economy. And many banks which were actually undergoing nationalization in 1960, the role of RBI has become more strategic towards the regulation of the credit in the banking system. And the focus of RBI has moved drastically towards managing the fiscal deficit also during this time. And when we had the economic reforms in 1990s, then the change in the financial needs of the economy demanded a new framework of the monetary policy. Interestingly, in 1998, RBI amended a multiple indicator approach, that is MIA, to capture in all the economic and financial variables into one frame. So in 2015, actually this idea of MIA came into consideration, or rather you can say came into implementation, with this agreement known as the Monetary Policy Framework Agreement, which was signed between government and RBI to formally adopt the flexible inflation targeting. This is actually the reference from Pami Dua paper 2020, wherein I hope we all know that Pami Dua is one of the member of the Monetary Policy Committee instituted to actually work on to the policy of monetary, and most importantly is to look at that how monetary policy can actually adapt this very important target of the flexible inflation. So with this new anchor of the new monetary policy in place, central bank has actually set down the inflation target, that is up to your 4% of consumer price index inflation from 2016 to 2021. This is the latest information that we had, so that's why I thought to discuss it here. So now, as we have seen the structure of evolution of monetary policy, and we had also had the discussion about the relevance of insurance sector in any economy. So let's actually jump on to the discussion, which is actually the core part of this paper, is that how does monetary policy affect insurance sector? Interestingly, we didn't have much of the literature to support my idea. So herein, this is the core aspect of understanding that how we can think of the elements through which monetary policy does affect insurance sector. Let us actually have a brief idea about the working of insurance sector before we directly jump onto that. A very slight discussion, not much one. The insurance business is slightly influenced by the state of economy, and major factors that affect it are the rate of growth, the level of domestic savings, household financial savings, and disposable income. This is actually the quote by Rajeshwari and Katheshwari in their paper in 2012. So I think this line itself exhibits the idea of insurance business. Basically, insurance companies provide risk management options to the receivers of the insurance and end up establishing insurance contracts to legalize and formalize the deal of working between insurers and insured ones. So in return for their services, insurance companies get payment from the insured party on regular basis, which is basically known as premium. And this insurance policy is basically a contract between the insurance providing company and insured organization or person or business for that matter. Obviously, having all that legalities on paper. Insurance is of different kinds. It can be for an asset, for human life, house, property, land. And I think we all relate to that because everybody of us have at least one kind of insurance secured in for our future. So I think we are not actually unaware of this concept of insurance at all. The concept is that what kind of insurance policies are available, because if we tend to have that detailed understanding of that, what kind of vibrant features that this insurance companies or insurance sector does provide, then through that we can actually try to have a very direct link of monetary policy with that. So we're going to go into the detailing. There are various kinds or ways of providing insurance options to the required parties depending upon their assets or possessions. And in general, the working of insurance sector is basically on two pillars. Let's understand that first one is types and values of different assets available within the economy or owned by the individual. So this is very important, is that we should be recognizing that what kinds of assets are available in the economy or possessed by the people and what are their values. And secondly, the current monetary and fiscal policy of the government. There are many facets to the link existing between the monetary policy and the working of insurance sector. To begin with, as we know that the objective of monetary policy is to directly affect the level of money supply and thus influencing the liquidity flow in the economy. And to fulfill it, then RBI has several tools at its disposal. So now, if we just assume that there has been a way through which the monetary policy aims at increasing the money supply in the economy. So we are just assuming is that if suppose monetary policy ends up increasing the money supply in the economy, then it would definitely going to boost the liquidity flow. With the increase in the liquidity flow, people were going to have more income or more money in their hands through any routes, whether it could be increase in employment opportunities, whether it could be increase in their income, whether it could be in the form of the higher loans that they could actually get. Through any routes, they can actually think of having increased money supply within their approach. And this we can actually call it in economics is that individuals were going to find increase in their purchasing power and start possessing valuable or any kind of such assets. Now, if we just imagine that if this is what is happening, is that increase in money supply is actually boosting the purchasing power of the people, and thus the people are in the possession of many assets and valuable items, then this tendency among the assets holder would lead to more buying of the insurance policy. And this can directly increase the working and the revenue of the insurance companies undoubtedly. So this is one way, is that wherein the monetary policy has a direct impact on insurance sector. Interestingly, in this case, it doesn't matter that whether the insured party is a consumer or a producer, because that is also one aspect, is that if suppose the person is a consumer, then if suppose he ends up possessing an asset, then he would buy the insurance policy to secure that value of that asset, right? And if we are talking about any manufacturer or producer who is involved in a business, or he has actually started any revenue earning activity, then he can again end up possessing an insurance sector for the safety of the capital or any kind of investment that he has taken up to run that business. So in short, with the increase in purchasing power, monetary policy has actually an impact on insurance sector. Again, moving on, another aspect is monetary policy focusing on improving the production, because as we have already discussed in the beginning, is that one of the main objectives of the monetary policy is to improve the production or the output level of the economy. So if that is so, then monetary policy by focusing on improving the production and thus employment, there would be a surge in the income earning individuals, with more people getting jobs and earning salaries. And now again, and thus employment, and thus most importantly provision of the jobs and salary earning options, then through this there would be more people who would be actually earning income, and there would be more addition of the people in the workforce. And now these new earners could be the new insured parties end up buying the insurance policy. So this is again aspect of understanding that how monetary policy can actually impact the working of insurance sector. Second element through which monetary policy does affect the insurance sector, because in the first discussion we had used the liquidity flow or the production as one of the tools through which monetary policy can affect insurance sector. So another element is the rate of interest. Monetary policy, as we all know, that do affect the interest rate in the economy in a very prominent way. Because, for example, if suppose RBI increases the discount rate in the economy, then it shoots up the market interest rates instantly, right? So because of this, we can actually think of increase in the interest rate in the economy. This interest rate does affect the profit level of the insurance companies. It is so because insurance companies' profit estimates on the total value of all the premiums paid by the party in the entire tenure of the policy and the total value of the insurance paid by the company. So we all know that it is nothing but a simple concept of annuity, wherein insurance company tries to judge out, or rather, calculate its profit on the basis of two amounts or two values available at its disposal. The first is that the present value of the insurance, if it has to pay in the future to that insured party. So as I said, that it is the total value of the insurance paid by the company, if any. So if any amount that insurance company has to pay in the future to that insured party, then insurance company would going to find out the present value of it. And to find out the present value in the concept of annuity, we do require the interest rate as one of the elements. The second one is the interest rate can actually affect also the present value of the premiums paid by the insurance receiving party. That means that insured party can actually be paying the premium for the entire tenure of the insurance policy. So now insurance company will going to find out the present value of that also. So with the difference of both of them, insurance company can think of whether this kind of a policy is profitable for its working or not. So in this way, interest rate is a very important element in making the link between monetary policy and insurance sector. So in such a case, insurance companies evaluate the present value, as we have already discussed, and the difference between these two present value is what is the profitable aspect or the return for the insurance company. So here is actually the link of interest rate, which can actually create the relation between these two. There is another element linking monetary policy and insurance sector is a distribution of income by the households for different economic and non-economic activity. So if a household allocates greater proportion of its earning for risky activities in the hope of, say, higher returns in the future, then it can affect the timely payments of the insurance premiums and can pose a serious risk of non-payment or delay in the premiums. So what is it highlighting is that if suppose the households tends to indulge in many of the risky activities, then these risky activities can actually pose a serious problem for the monetary aspect of this household, and it can actually impact the timely payment of the insurance premiums that have to be paid. So this can actually cost insurance company a lot. So this is again very important aspect. Another one is that if suppose households income involves risky activities, that means the households sources of income involve many of the risky activities, then again it means that there is possibility of highly unstable flow of income, and it can again hinder the smooth flow of insurance premiums. So greater the risk an insured individual takes up, higher is the risk of the loss for the insurance company. It is also noted that the working of the insurance company also depend a lot on the many development factors. This is something very interesting to look at. Let's understand it here. Is that there are many development factors in the economy on which the working of the insurance company does depend. For example, better the medical facilities and health infrastructure in the economy, lower the death rates and better longevity, which can actually, benefit the working of the insurance company, because first of all, they can assume more and more people indulging in having the insurance because of the better infrastructure of health and everything. Because of that, they can be more productive and they can end up having more income and thus insuring themselves. The second aspect of the same thing is that if suppose they have better longevity, then insurance companies can think of having continued flow of premiums coming from the insured party for a long period of time. So this is one other aspect of the benefit that insurance companies can think of. Higher the level of income or wage equality in the economy, more equal and better employment and income generating opportunities would be available, and thus higher possibility of large number of insurance contracts establishing. Means if you have better equality in terms of the provision of the wages or the income, that means there would be equal and uniform opportunities of employment available, and thus we can expect higher level of insurance contracts coming up. Another way is that with a greater investment level in the economy taking place, there would be higher possibility of insurance policies to be brought by the entrepreneurs or the manufacturers, especially we are talking for the startups. So if there would be more opportunities for the entrepreneurs to come up and set up their own businesses, then we can think of more insurance policies coming up into the flow of these insurance sector. So herein we have actually discussed a lot about the link between monetary policy and insurance sector. And now we're going to actually try to link it with the evolution of insurance sector and with the evolution of the monetary policy. So let's have a look at it here. Working of insurance sector has been definitely led by Life Insurance Corporation, LIC, the sole public sector company dealing in life insurance business. And this working of LIC has been changing with the change in the monetary policy. We're going to discuss that. The insurance companies have been undergoing several changes, especially from the time we had economic reforms in India. And because we have actually seen that there has been a new framework of monetary policy to manage the domestic and foreign exchange reserves at that time. And insurance sector has benefited a lot due to FDI, because as per Union Budget 2019 and 20, there has been 100% of FDI which was allowed for insurance intermediaries. With a new anchor of the monetary policy in place, that is your flexible inflation targeting, the steps by the Monetary Policy Committee has been towards achieving the inflation target. And this has an appropriate impact on the interest rate also, and thus it has actually in turn affected the profitability of the insurance sector. Under MIA, if you remember, we had discussed about multiple indicator approach. Under MIA, central banks' decision and actions would be dependent on many economic variables like foreign trade, capital flows, inflation, growth, banking stability, etc. And this new flexibility with RBI to capture in all the growth parameters is actually helping the insurance sector also to encompass its functioning accordingly. And the data from the insurance sector supports the idea, because we have this data from the annual reports of LIC, which says that the share of rural to new businesses in terms of policies has increased drastically from 1980s to 2000. So with this data, we can easily support that the working of the monetary policy has a major impact on the insurance sector. So I'm not going to take much of the time. I'm just going to conclude my discussion saying that in India, the relation between the monetary policy and the working of the insurance sector is quite noticeable through many facets. And thus, there is a serious need for operating this monetary policy in an appropriate manner so that it not only fulfills the objectives for the entire economy, but also specifically help in actually expanding the reach of the insurance sector. So thank you so much for your patience and time.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for making such an informative and detailed presentation on the monetary policy and insurance sector. So participants, you may please post your questions in the chat box, and please mention the name of the speaker to whomever you are asking the questions. So we are running short of time, so please make your questions fast. Now I call upon Dr. Munir Babu, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, NMSM Government College, to moderate the QA session. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon, one and all. We had two presentations and one interesting keynote address. And Dr. Shraddha Verma provided a talk on economic growth in India, a critical perspective, and he shed light on the pitfall of growth story of India and provided a critical perspective on high growth of Indian economy, whereas with high inequality. And he also pointed out some issues such as jobless growth to job loss growth and distresses in farming sector, whereas the private consumption increased during the reforms period. Okay. And thereafter we had a presentation by Mrs. Gobiga Gigi and presented a topic on the post reforms in Kerala and capital accumulation in Kerala. And briefly discussed class mobilizations and labor mobilization, labor migration, and deterred the process of capital accumulation in Kerala. And whereas class compromise and neoliberal policies and other issues were discussed. And finally, Mrs. Shraddha Verma provided a talk on, presented a paper, impact of monetary policy, especially on insurance sector, and also shed light on the recent changes in the monetary policy framework. And now the floor is open for Q&A question and answer session. Please post your question on the chat box. And we have already a few questions. And one question is to Shraddha Guha. Yeah, I will read the question, then it will be easy to answer. It is seen that along with the economic growth in developing countries like India, the formalization in the labor market is on the rise. At the same time, the states are also withdrawing from social security measures. How can the economy address this issue? The question is to Shraddha, Dr. Shraddha.
Okay.
Yes.
So should I answer now or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Is there any other questions to you, sir? No.
No, I guess no. Okay. So I'll answer.
Please answer.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this question. And it's an interesting question. Now, I just like to clarify one thing here, just to add to the question. It is earlier we thought it was only in developing countries that we were seeing increasing informalization. But it is actually now a global phenomenon. It is also true for developed countries as well. It is not only for India. That's the first, point I thought to add. Now, we see that rising growth with increasing informalization, and as you rightly pointed out, the withdrawal of state from social security measure. Now, all these are happening together because these are all part of one single package. If you follow the whole logic of the Washington Consensus or the neoliberal model, these are all supposed to happen together. Let's take one by one. So when they say that the free flow of capital, free flow of labor, there should not be any hindrances from the side of the government, labor market intervention, what happens is that companies are given complete free ride, they can really regulate the contracts in the labor market, because let us not get fooled by the simplistic assumption of perfect competition. The labor market is not perfectly competitive. It is more of a monopolistic structure, or even if you think there are few buyers and there are many sellers in every labor market. So laborers are already in that, in a position where their bargaining power is not that much. Now, what happens is, as the government reduces its importance or its significance, or its, as you pointed out, social security measures and so on, it actually increases the vulnerability of the working class more. So if you just think from the standard, economics perspective, what it does, it creates therefore, a lower, fallback option. So the workers, mostly the informal workers, they have no other option but to accept a lower wage or even go for a low earning self-employment, which is predominantly the case in India. Now, these are all part of the same package. They are not like as if the informalization is a distortion of the free market economy. It is not. It is bound to lead to that kind of a structure because of the huge pool of labor that we have, because the moment the state withdraws, the institution crumbles. Now, if you want to compare this with the developed countries, like Gopika was presenting, in a class understanding between different agencies. If you look at the developed countries, in the post-World War II scenario, they had a strong Keynesian state and they had that kind of institutional arrangement. It was more of a tripartite arrangement where the state, the business class and the working class came into some kind of understanding. But they have very strong institutions. Their own institutions are also crumbling. And we hardly had that kind of strong institution, whatever the rhetorics be of the previous regimes. And whatever little we had, we are losing those institutions over the last 30 years or so. So when these things are happening, the informalization is not a distortion. It is structurally supposed to happen that way. So, if you see that the government is reducing its importance, the government is supposed to, because otherwise, the labor market would have a fallback option. If the laborers have fallback option, they would not be so vulnerable. If they're not so vulnerable, how will profit share increase? And then how will accumulation investment growth increase? So therefore, in one hand, if the investment has to increase, the logic of neoliberal capitalism is that the working class's power should be as minimum as possible. And the working class's power is always mediated through the state. Now, you need to understand one thing. The state is not merely a representative of a capital or labor per se. State is a space of contradictions between different classes. And therefore, the state's policies keep hovering around in one way or the other based on the whole political scenario. So the economic can address this. So first point, these are all part of one single package. And it is not only happening with developing countries, it discard the merit of his criticism. Now, there I'm saying the market-led decentralization will not work. We need more of cooperative arrangements at the workspace. And that is where the moment you can shift towards cooperatives as well as opposed to corporations, you can address the problem of social security, the informal labor. You can also to an extent address the problem of social security, because a large segment of the labor force will not be in a position where they would be really vulnerable to seek for other securities. They may have a little bit of bargaining power and they may have much better earning as opposed to the situation now. And at the same time, what that would do, that would also politically increase the power of the working class to keep the checks and balance on the state, like I was saying in the post-World War II scenario. And then the state perhaps would be inclined to make more provisions of that kind. That is something that is missing now. So in my opinion, in short, it is not addressable within this paradigm, because if you try to fix one side of the story, the other problem will arise. As Gopika was saying, the system tries to manage, the regime tries to manage certain crises, it has to reorganize itself. Now within this regime, I think this problem is going to persist unless we see a very significant change in the way we organize production, and also importantly, the way the governments are functioning. And for that, pressure groups have to be created, more political awareness has to be created, democratization has to be there. There has to be increasing pressure on the governments across countries, I'm saying. That's all.
Yeah, thank you, Shraddha, for your answer. And we have few more questions from the participants. Yeah, the question is to Ms. Shraddha Verma. We have two questions to Ms. Shraddha Verma. First question is from Vijay. The question is, does transmission mechanism observed in the country like India through interest rate? And we have one more question from Mian Das. Why RBI has failed in effectively regulating the banking system? And also, why is Reserve Bank of India failed in controlling credit?
All right, thank you for the questions. I'll answer the first one. So monetary transmission is all about actually channelizing through four ways: interest rate, credit, exchange rate, and asset prices. And interestingly, in India, the performance of the monetary policy transition has not been very you can say appreciable, because the Indian financial system, it has been remained bank dominated, though the share of non-banking finance companies have been there, but it is actually increasing very slowly and gradually. So overall efficacy of the monetary transmission in India hinges basically on the extent and the pace with which the banks, taking a cue or maybe induced by the changes in the monetary policy repo rate, and adjust their deposits and lending rates and adequately meeting the economy's demand for credit. So overall, the data says that the pass through from the policy rate changes to bank lending rates has been quite slow. So this lack of adequate monetary transmission remains a key concern. So it blunts the impact of its policy changes on the economic activity. So we can actually think of maybe having certain changes coming from RBI and monetary policy to implement this kind of a transmission. So hope I am able to answer the first question. The second one is that why RBI has not been able to take control of the credit. I think we cannot be so blunt about this statement, because RBI has been actually working very effectively in making the things possible, and rather most importantly making the flow of the credit happening in the economy through various tools. Though there could be a possibility that during certain situations or circumstances, the effect of that RBI policy may not be very appropriate in making that goals fulfilled. But we cannot actually be so, rigid about the statement that RBI is not at all doing anything to control the credit. Rather, RBI has been actually improvising, as we have just discussed in our discussion, is that monetary policy has evolved a lot, and rather it has actually started, expanding its horizon a lot so that it can actually encompass more variables and more aspects into its consideration, so that it can actually impact many of the sectors of the economy. So it is not actually something that I can actually adhere to, but I can just say that yes, RBI is functioning, but yes, it has to actually work upon how it functions. Hope my questions are being answered effectively.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you, Ms. Shraddha, for your answer. And we have one more question. Yeah, the question is to Ms. Gobika. The question is, I remember you saying that capital accumulation was not present during the pre-reform period in Kerala, but it is seen that even during the pre-reform period, there used to be a lot of capital accumulation as an impact of Gulf migration, NRI contribution. What is your take on it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And actually, it's true that following Gulf migration and this NRI contribution, and it was getting invested in land as a asset or a real estate asset. But the thing is, it was not being used for the reproduction of capital, as like in order to create more surplus out of that capital, like productive investment, maybe like industries or agriculture reproduction and all. So that's what I mean. Clearly, funds were coming, but they were not getting invested into a capitalistic reproduction where the fund is used. I mean, if you are just buying a land and keeping it there, that is not a capitalistic reproduction. That is just asset generation. So the feature was more asset generation was taking place, but not the capitalistic reproduction, because there were the mentioned issues in like surplus generation. That's all. I hope I answered it.
Yes. Now let us stop the Q&A session. Your question is complete. Almost, there is no more question.
Okay, thank you, sir. The feedback form will be available soon in the chat box, in Google Meet and also in the YouTube. And the link will be available only for half an hour, so make it fast. Now, I request Mr. Biju Abraham, Assistant Professor and Head of Department of Economics, NMSM Government College, to propose the vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon to all of you. And this is the time of pandemic where we are asked to keep social distancing. But the challenge of keeping social distance also has taught us to seek other alternatives, and this technology has provided us an opportunity to bring us together. And at this juncture, we have organized this seminar, and I would like to, at the end of the day, I'm sure we are on short of time, and therefore I would like to go directly into the vote of thanks. First, I would like to thank the Professor Shibu, who has presided over the function, and also to Dr. Rajmal Ammas, the principal in charge of this college, for inaugurating this session. Then we have a very thought-provoking this brainstorming as well as insightful discussions the papers presented by Dr. Shraddha Guha, Ms. Gobiga, as well as Ms. Verma were really insightful and thought-provoking. Thank you all the resource person for such a wonderful paper that you have presented. And I also would like to thank Professor Bashir, who has been the organizer of this program, Dr. Munir Babu, who has handled these sessions, this question session, and also to all the faculty members who was associated with this organizing this program, especially Aguila, who was handled this the entire session. And finally, I would like to thank all the participants of the program who has been with us almost for the last 2.5 hours. Thank you all for staying back with us. To all the participants who has actively participated in this question answer session. Thank you one and all for such a wonderful event that we have. And we also hope that in future you will be joining us to make all our future events successful. Thank you once again.
Thank you, sir. And with that, we formally end the webinar. Hope you all had a wonderful time. Thank you and spending your valuable time with us and for your kind cooperation to make this webinar a grand success. Thank you one and all. Once again, reminding you, fill up the feedback form at the earliest. It will be available only for half an hour. Thank you.